these are the general lecture notes for Harriet Jacobs, who is the second author in our week 11 section. So she was born into slavery in the fall of 1813. So her mother was a slave. She belonged to a woman named Margaret Horniblow. But her grandmother was actually a freed woman. And she didn't really realize that she was property of another human until she was about 6 years old. And so Margaret Horniblow was like very kind to her. She taught her how to sew. She taught her how to read, among some other things, before she died in 1825. And in her will, Margaret had bequeathed her, like not sold really, like left her like a piece of property and she was 11 years old, to her 3 year old niece, who's Mary Norcom. And Mary was a toddler, obviously, so she couldn't be the master. So she was a kind of ipso facto or de facto property of Mary's parents, who were Dr. James and Maria Norcom. And so it was living with them where she got an education on what slave life was really about, and specifically what slave life was like for a young girl. So Dr. Norcom, not a good guy, sexually abused her from the time she was 18, from 1825 until 1842. So that's a long time to live underneath that abuse. Um, so several times her grandmother, whose name was Molly Hornblow, which that was not uncommon for a slave, especially a free slave, to take on the name of the master that they had lived under, like they were known as property of that person. So her free grandmother, Molly, tried to help her get out of her situation, but she was so ashamed and embarrassed of the fact that she had had this sexual relation with this man for this long period of time. Obviously, it wasn't her fault. It was completely forced upon her. It was just part of it was just common. It was common. It was common for young black women, slaves, to have children by their white owners. And it's kind of the whole idea that Southern patriarchy, if the man is the king, and what he says goes, and if he wants to take on several mistresses, then that's okay, and the wife just kind of had to accept that. And that was very commonplace during that time period. So she was embarrassed by but what she had been forced to endure. So she was really unable to reveal to her grandmother what exactly all that that she had been forced into. So her desperation turned her to start an illicit affair with a white lawyer by the name of Samuel Trevor Sawyer, who was a white attorney in at the time there, and in North Carolina. And and this was literally to escape the situation that she had faced with Dr. Norcom. So she starts this relationship with Samuel Trevor Sawyer. She has 2 children by him, Louisa and Joseph. And by the time she was 20. And so she's had 2 children with this guy by the time she was 20 years old. And so this was, in her mind, and she says this later in her autobiography, that she did this with deliberate calculation. She entered into this relationship with this man because she felt like it could get her into the right avenue to escape from her situation. And that's exactly what she does. She encourages Sawyer to, or convinces him really, to purchase her 2 children from Norcom. and to kind of protect him from his abuse, especially his daughter. Didn't want him to fall into that kind of same situation. And so she, in 1835, she hides herself in her grandmother's crawl space, like in the attic. And she stays there for the next 7 years, sewing, reading her Bible, keeping watch over her children, getting information about them when she could, sending information to them when she could, and sending letters to Norcom. She's a fugitive at this point, and sending letters to kind of throw him off her trail to Norcom. And so Sawyer, he has her 2 children at that time. But in 1837, he was elected to the House of Representatives, and he moves to Washington, D.C. without emancipating either one of their children. He sends their oldest child, who is Louisa, to work in New York as a housemaid. Now, she's not a slave, but she's working as a servant in New York. And so in 1842, several years later, Jacobs manages to escape to the north by boat. And she's a fugitive now, so at any point in time, if she's caught, she can be brought back to let the fugitive slave bill that we talked about several times at this point. She could be caught and brought back to Norcom at any point in time. And so her life was filled with uncertainty and tension, and she lived in fear of being captured and brought back into slavery. She managed to find her daughter in Brooklyn, and she brought them together to live together with Joseph, her son. They moved to Boston, and Jacobs goes to work for Mary Stace Willis as a nursemaid to the Willis's youngest child. Her husband, Mary Stace Willis's husband, was Nathaniel Parker Willis, and we talked about him before, but he was a popular editor and poet at the time period. So Dr. Norcom made several attempts to find her through all this time. He was on her trail constantly, trying to locate her, trying to track her down. And so she stayed on the move a lot to avoid being recaptured. And so in 1849, she moves to Rochester, New York, where she begins working with her brother John in a bookstore. It was actually a reading room, and it had an anti-slavery bookstore. They published books, and so this anti-slavery book room, a reading room and bookstore, was above the offices of Frederick Douglass's newspaper, the North Star. And there, through that reading room, she met a woman named Amy Post, who was an abolitionist, a feminist. And they fell into an easy friendship, and Jacobs, confided a lot in Amy Post, and Post began encouraging her to tell her story. But again, here she is. She's still a slave. She's a fugitive slave. Telling her story would be detrimental to her safety. And so it just really wasn't, it was just kind of an afterthought in the back of her mind. So in 1852, Cornelia Grinnell Willis, who was the second wife of Mary Stace Willis, passed away. Nathaniel Parker Willis married Cornelia, and Cornelia granted Jacobs her freedom. And she decided then that she could write her autobiography as a free woman. So initially, her primary motive in writing this story was to talk to white women, to point out to white women in the North, kind of to try to elicit sympathy for the thousands of slave mothers in the South in bondage who live in this sexual tyranny. They have their children taken away from them and sold, and she's really trying to elicit sympathy in the beginning with the writing of this autobiography. She also wanted to kind of indict these white men, these white slave-owning men, for their sexual crimes against black women. And she felt like that white women, who at the time, were being taught to live and turn a blind eye to what their husbands were doing in order to keep the peace, and she really felt like she could gain some sympathy for the situation that she was in. So she wanted to write about all of these things very frankly, very fully. However, she was ashamed of her relationship with Sawyer, because Samuel Trevor Sawyer, because she had entered into a willing relationship with a white man, albeit for, legitimate reasons, to escape Norcom, or to get on the right path to escaping Norcom, and then eventually to protecting the lives of her children. So she was ashamed of that. So she just decided to really own up to it. She fully acknowledged her transgressions. She decided to not live her life as a victim, but rather as an agent for change, because she was a woman that was motivated solely by her desire for freedom, and then eventually for the freedom of her children. And so, again, I said this earlier before. She says, I knew what I did, and I did it with deliberate calculation. She says, yeah, I've done this thing. So for all of you haters, you doubters that, would point out that, oh, I'm writing this book about my life at the hands of white men, and here I enter into a willing relationship with one. She knew that people were going to be judgmental of that fact. And so she owned up to it. She was very deliberate in her purpose of writing about owning up to her transgressions. So in 1853, she's writing all these kind of bits and pieces. It's not a text, it's not a novel or an autobiography at this point. So in 1853, she's sending you this information in these letters to the New York Tribune, and they're printing them in small collections, and she's detailing the sexual abuse. She's detailing the plight of slave mothers who could not protect their own children, or forced to witness their children being sold and forced into servitude and forced into sexual slavery, and all these things that were happening. And she's piecing together her book. It takes her about 4 years to kind of piece together the entire story. So by the summer of 1857, she had it finished. But she ran into some issues getting it printed. Initially, the people that she contracted to print it went out of business, and so she kind of had to start the process all over again. But in 1860, in the summer of 1860, she was able to get Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl published by a Boston printer. However, the Civil War started right about that time, and so her book kind of got overshadowed by the Civil War, and it fell into obscurity for the rest of her lifetime, and even beyond that, for almost 100 years. The book, after that first initial printing, it was never reprinted in her lifetime, and so 1862 to 1866, she begins devoting herself to relief efforts for former slaves who'd become refugees of the Civil War. She and her daughter established a school in Alexandria, Virginia. It didn't last very long, but after it closed, she continued. She moved back to the South to work in relief efforts for freed men and women. Racial violence drove them out of the South and back to the North, where she opened a boarding house. Not much is known about her. The last 10 years or so of her life, she lived very obscurely, and she died in Washington, D.C. on March the 7th, 1897. So almost 100 years later, the 1960s, 1970s, from the time her book was written, almost 100 years. The civil rights movement at the time, women's rights movements, kind of rekindled printing of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and it led Jacob's narrative to take its place as a major African-American slave narrative, and for her to be recognized as the first woman to author a fugitive slave narrative in the United States. And it still remains to this day a critical part of both American women's literature, African American women's literary canons, also the slave and fugitive slave narratives. It's a very prominent text in those canons.